start because although we have much the shortest time period of the 3 lectures today, there is a lot to be said in it, and it will be lovely to start. You remember that the last slide yesterday was of the 3 great men who dominated the Yalta Conference of 1945 February, when World War II was in its very last phase. And we are now starting, of course, with the aftermath of that war and what it led to. As far as the outside world is concerned, I think when we, who basically have all grown up in, you can call the Western world, you think of the Cold War. And it's good to bear that in mind, that in most of the period that we are dealing with up to 1991, the Soviet Union was, to the West, rather an unknown quantity, except for a few experts. And my understanding of many of those experts is that everything they predicted never came right. So I think it was not an easy place to understand. But we are in the heart of the Soviet Union now and dealing with a country that was probably more shattered and lost numerically, but not percentage-wise, more people in World War II than any other country in the Soviet Union. At least 20 million people are known to have perished in that wartime, not necessarily all at the hands of the Germans. And the country was, if you come to think of it, and it includes Crimea, the whole of European Russia was invaded by Hitler in 1941, and the Germans got right across European Russia, as you know, to the Volga River and were held back at Stalingrad. And Crimea is well to the west of that. So during the war, it was under German occupation, and a lot of destruction was wrought in the course of that invasion. And then when the Red Army pushed the Germans back, again, it was like a double whammy. Renewed war, renewed destruction, renewed atrocities of all kinds through the western part of European Russia, through Ukraine, Belarus, and even through Crimea, as the Red Army drove the Germans out and towards Berlin. So Crimea, like other parts, has suffered a double invasion and a double destruction. Sevastopol, and here is what it looked like after World War II. Well, it's not an uncommon sort of picture. You see a picture of Berlin, and it will look much the same. But basically, in Sevastopol, very little was left standing. Rebuilding it was one of Stalin's patriotic priorities, and I've told you before, it is one of the 12 hero cities of the Soviet Union. But the rest of Crimea, infrastructure, agriculture, industry, all those sorts of things, remained unrepaired and neglected for years. Crimea's population decreased, both because of the war and because, as you will know from yesterday, the entire Crimean Tatar population was expelled in 1944. The result was, and there was an inflow of people to work on the collective farms of Crimea and the factories, mainly from Russia and Ukraine, an increasingly Slavic population. At the time in 1944-45, probably about 71% of the population would have said they were Russian and spoke Russian and felt Russian. The Tatars, as I've said, had disappeared, and most of the things that they held dear, most of the buildings, the monuments, even the gravestones, were knocked down and obliterated. History, a group of historians got together sometime in the late 40s to discuss Tatar history. And as we've seen, it's a long and complex and not by any means always a bad story. And they concluded that all Tatars were brigands and traitors. And that was the very extraordinary conclusion they came to. So the Tatars were in Uzbekistan, and things were pretty grim. Things changed, as we know, and I do remember that so well myself, and people as old as me may too. Stalin died in early March 1953, and everybody knew that things were going to change after Stalin, who'd been there for so long, but nobody knew how. And then, of course, there was a massive power struggle, as you would imagine, to be his successor. Now, I've just put this up because I think that the Soviet Union was not always an easy thing for other people to understand. It's the ex-Russian Empire from the imperial days, and it was divided into 15 union republics, one for each of the 15 major nationalities of the Soviet Union. Now, much the biggest, as you can see, is the red one, and of course that's Russia, and that is still basically the territory of the Russian Federation to this day. It is much the largest country in the world still, even though the rest of the Soviet Union is no longer part of the territory. The next largest was Kazakhstan in terms of area, but population-wise, only about 17 million people, I think. The third largest in population, and definitely the second most important economically, number 6, yellow, Ukraine. And so, without going into any detail, I will say that each of these republics had its own communist party. So there was a Ukrainian Communist Party, a Russian Communist Party, a Kazakh, and so on. They each had their own parliament, which was called a Supreme Soviet. Naturally, with there being no political opposition, it was really just a rubber stamp for whatever needed to be done. So there was a party and a parliament for each republic. And then there was the Soviet parliament, the Supreme Soviet in Moscow, and the Soviet Communist Party, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which was the sort of big overarching brother of all the brotherly communist parties. So maybe that will help explain. And as you see, this must be a post-1954 map, because they have made, they've very definitely put Crimea as part of Ukraine. Right, I hope that just, we don't need to go into any more detail about that, I don't think, but it helps to explain how the power struggle played out, because there were several candidates to replace Stalin as supreme ruler of the Soviet Union, and one of them, not one of the most fancied, was a little man called Nikita Khrushchev. And Nikita Khrushchev was not Ukrainian, which a lot of people think he was, but he was Russian. But he had spent most of his life working in Ukraine, in the Ukrainian Communist Party, and he'd worked his way up to be the first secretary of the Ukrainian Communist Party. In other words, the boss of the Communist Party of Ukraine, which was a powerful position. And he had seen Ukraine through the war. He'd seen it through a dreadful civil war after the war, because there was a Ukrainian nationalist fight. They wanted to keep Ukraine independent. They didn't want the Soviet Union back. There was a bitter civil war. Many people were killed. He masterminded the Soviet campaign, and by 1950 he was definitely #1 in Ukraine, but not necessarily in Moscow, where there were other people, like, for instance, the chairman of the Council of Ministers, Molotov, effectively the Prime Minister of the Soviet Union, was probably the favoured candidate. But Khrushchev was very clever, and he gradually made his way through. Obviously, what was important was to get allies and friends, and one of the people he really wanted on his side, because there was going to have to be a vote as to who became the first secretary of the Soviet Communist Party, was the incoming first secretary of the Ukrainian Communist Party, a man who was called, oh dear, what was he called? Sorry about it, I've got it somewhere, it doesn't really matter. Anyway, Khrushchev did get himself the position of first secretary of the Soviet Communist Party already in 1953, but Molotov was still the chairman of the Council of Ministers. You've got two top dogs in the Soviet Union. And the first thing that Khrushchev had to do was to get rid of Molotov, which he did in one way or another, it doesn't matter, and bring in a much more cooperative man called Bulganin. And I do remember when I was at school in England, Bulganin and Khrushchev came to Britain on a state visit when Eden was Prime Minister, and the papers called them bulge and crush because they found the Bulganin and Khrushchev far too difficult, so they were known as bulge and crush. So Khrushchev is getting into he wants to get rid of Bulganin eventually too, and he then becomes the supreme boss, as Stalin had always been. And what way he has to get allies? How is he going to do that? Well, he thinks of one thing, and that is to give Ukraine a present. Now, a lot of people, the sort of myth is that he was drunk when he said, let's give the Crimea to Ukraine. It would have been so nice for them to have it. I very much doubt that's the case. In 1954, the Soviet Union celebrated the 300th anniversary of the Treaty of Pereyaslav. You remember when the Cossack leader swore allegiance to the Grand Prince of Moscow? And the 300th anniversary had to be celebrated somehow because it was a very important thing in the growth of Russia as a state and then the Soviet Union. So they decided that what they would do is to give Crimea to Ukraine. That would be a very nice way of doing it. And they had great celebrations about this. And here we have one of my favorite slides that I found for this. This is actually from a Ukrainian book now from their Institute of International Affairs, and they've added a little thing at the bottom, which is myths. It's quite a useful thing, but that wasn't there, of course, in the poster, which basically says 300 years of union between Ukraine and Russia, and at the bottom it says, as I've said, in brotherly friendship lies our strength. And there is, on the left, we have Mr. Russia, and on your right, we have Mr. Ukraine in his peasant shirt. And I can't think which one I think is more gorgeous. I don't know what you think. What I do know is when I visited the USSR as a student, not so many years later, I didn't see anyone who looked remotely like that. Anyway, it was sprung very much as a surprise. Pravda, the newspaper of the Communist Party, announced on the 25th of February 1954 that Crimea would be a gift to Ukraine as a noble act of the Russian people to commemorate Pereyaslav and to evince the boundless love and trust that the Russians feel towards the Ukrainians. But the Ukrainians, I must tell you, didn't feel it at all towards the Russians, or many of them didn't. There's just been a very bad civil war. Now, why? Why really? And this is something people have been puzzling about ever since. The director of Harvard's Cold War Studies program says he doesn't think Pereyaslav has got anything to do with it because Crimea in 1654, as you well know, was a Tatar territory ruled by the Crimean Tatars in alliance with the Ottoman Empire. It was nothing to do with Pereyaslav. It didn't go anywhere in 1654. So why? He says Khrushchev wanted to show the Ukrainians the benefits of being in the USSR after the Civil War. And secondly, that he needed allies, as I've rather said to you, in order to do with Mr. Malenkov and a few others. And certainly, I see his name was Alexei Krychenko, who was the first secretary now of the Ukrainian Communist Party, was a very important ally. Other historians of Ukraine, too, I've been reading, suggest more the economic and the geographical reasons. That Crimea was in a bad state. Khrushchev had visited it and they said, listen, we need help. Our agriculture has collapsed, our industries are in ruins. And it was easier really to get people from Ukraine, possibly, to Crimea than it would be to Russia. But I'm not sure that that necessarily, in the days of the Soviet Union, necessitated transferring the territory. So I don't think that was the underlying reason. To me, it seems to be political. But anyway, whatever it is, I don't think that Khrushchev was drunk, which he frequently was, but not then, when he had the idea, if in fact he ever had it. And it was all perfectly legal. It wasn't just an arbitrary gift. The 1936 Soviet Constitution said it was okay to transfer land from one republic to another, provided that both republics agreed to it, and that this agreement was rubber-stamped by their parliaments, by their Supreme Soviets. And this was done by both the Ukrainian and the Russian parliament, and therefore it was all perfectly legal and constitutional. So one of the arguments that Russia has now, which was that it wasn't legal and constitutional back in 1954, doesn't actually hold water. Right. You must remember also that in the Soviet Union, you've seen the map now, everything was so centralized in Moscow that it actually made precious little difference whether one small district, which is all that Crimea was in the Russian Federation or in Ukraine. And it wasn't really an issue. It became a great issue after the Soviet Union collapsed, as you know. Right. In fact, nobody made a fuss about it then, but as soon as the Soviet Union started to fragment, Russian nationalists started complaining about it. A poet In the early 1990s, a Russian poet said, "On the ruins of our superpower, there is a major paradox of history. Sevastopol, the city of Russian glory, is outside Russian territory." That was the sort of feeling that was already coming up then. So let's look and see how Crimea fared in post-war Ukraine. It was very, very popular for both Russian and other Soviet tourists. Also, remember, we are now in the Cold War. Eastern Europe was satellite states under Soviet control. All the East Europeans were also coming across and enjoying Crimea. Had lots of tourism. Lot of sanatoria for people who needed a health cure, many of which are only half built, I might say, and still are standing as strange sort of concrete structures amidst this beautiful landscape, rather unfortunately. I rather think the Russians may have done something about that since. But there were a lot of sanatoria. One of the perennial problems with Crimea has been lack of water. And one of the first measures that was done was the Great North Crimea Canal, which was built ostensibly by volunteers from the Young Communists, the Komsomol, who got special tickets to go and spend their holidays hacking the earth, rather hot and dry, as you can see, the canal went all the way from the Dnieper River, which is a huge river, flows down from Kiev in Ukraine. Here's the Dnieper, lots of hydroelectric works on it, down here, and comes out into the sea, the Dnipro, as Ukrainians call it, there. And they took a canal and brought it all this way down, and it has provided up to 80% of the water used in Crimea. No more, I might say, but up to a few years ago. So it was tremendously important. It took quite a long time. I think it was finished in about 1970. Irrigation was the main purpose for which its water was used, and very soon grapes were being grown again, wheat was being harvested, and Crimean agriculture was back on track. Now, I'd like to just mention that, as you know, the Cold War is on, and a very interesting place, if ever you go to Ukraine, and that's a bit of an issue at the moment, but if you go to Ukraine and you go to Balaclava, which is very much in the Crimean War, very near where the charge of the Light Brigade happened, there is, right down on the water of this little inlet, an almost invisible little tunnel there. And nobody knew what that was. And it was, in fact, a submarine facility for Soviet nuclear submarines. They were kept in there, and they were also serviced there. Inside, it's of course empty now. You can actually go and visit it. It looks like this. It was a great long tunnel. It was an extraordinary feature. And that whole area, Sevastopol as well, was what was known as a closed city. Most cities in the Soviet Union were closed for one reason or another to foreigners, and certainly that part of Ukraine was. So it was all very, very strategic. The Crimean Tatars, meanwhile, as I've said, are stuck in Uzbekistan, and they're not allowed back. In 1956, they were specifically told, whereas some other groups who had been sent to Central Asia were allowed back, they were told they would never be allowed back. So they're in Uzbekistan. And Crimea is changing all the time. I'm not going to talk any more about the Soviet period, but as you know, and it's well within the living memories of all but my grandchildren who are here, in 1985, M.S. Gorbachev became first secretary of the Soviet Communist Party. Now, you all know what that means. It means he's the most powerful man, never mind the government. The first secretary of the Communist Party is the most powerful man in the Soviet Union. I've lost my mic. That's rather sad. Hello? I better hold it. I get too excited, that's the trouble. Anyway, Gorbachev, as you probably will remember, wanted to reform the Soviet Union, but he did not want to destroy it. Unfortunately, and there are parallels in our own history, as soon as you start to reform something, it tends to run away with you. So his economic reforms, which were perestroika, His détente with Ronald Reagan, you remember, and sort of trying to stop the arms race, which is the USSR, whose economy was in a very bad way, couldn't afford. And then finally, glasnost, a word difficult to translate, but it means sort of openness, clarity, saying what you think, which of course it was never a very good idea in the USSR before this. And people started to say what they think. And in the Soviet Union, made up of so many different nationalities, not only the 15 major ones that you have seen, each with its own republic, but there were many smaller nationalities too, they all started saying, well, we want independence. We don't want to be bossed around by Moscow anymore. And nowhere, particularly after 1986, when at the end of April 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear power station north of Kiev exploded and scattered radioactive ash all over large parts of Eastern Europe, and particularly over Ukraine and Belarus. People in that part of the world, they said, if that's what the Soviet Union is about now, we want out of it. So Mr. Gorbachev started something that he couldn't stop. And for our purposes, the important one is that he started the expression of nationalist ambitions to break away from the USSR. This sort of reached a peak in the year 1991. When the country really was in a tremendous ferment. He'd had a freely elected parliament with opposition figures in Moscow, the Congress of People's Deputies, in 1989. In 1990, the republics were given a great deal more control over their own affairs, and the Communist Party was no longer the only party that was illegal. And Mr. Yeltsin, who's the the president of Russia, who made himself president of Russia, in fact, he would be the first secretary of the Communist Party, was the most powerful man now really in Russia. And Gorbachev, actually the president of the Soviet Union, had become almost irrelevant. It's an extraordinary story. And nevertheless, he still had all his privileges. And in August 1991, when this nationalist ferment was going on, he was on holiday on the coast, somewhere between Balaclava and Yalta. There's a beautiful little place called Foros, and there is, as you see, a dacha number 11 of the Soviet Union, where Mikhail Gorbachev was put under house arrest, because what happened in August 1991, I wonder if you can remember that, there was an attempt by members of the Soviet Communist Party to block what was going on, to put the clock back, to get rid of people like Yeltsin and, for that matter, Gorbachev, let alone all the more sort of strong nationalists and Democrats, and to put the clock back. And it was really touch and go. It was a very, very dangerous time. What they did was to come down to Foros and ask him to declare a military law, martial law. He refused to do so, so they went back and declared it anyway and kept him under house arrest. And it was only really in Moscow, where there were huge demonstrations, and Yeltsin sort of led the demonstrations, that stopped the... is this noise making you bothered? I can try and clip it on, but I'm just not sure whether I know how to do it. Let's see. Oh, you are here. Good. Thank you. I think it will be better. Thank you. Sorry, it fell off. I'm probably too active. Thank you. Yeah. Just try and make it nice and firm. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you. Okay, I'll try not to do that again. Thank you, Nicole. Right. So it was a very dramatic year, and it ended. The coup it failed, and the plotters were duly jailed, but not executed or anything like that, and they were let out very shortly after. Mr. Gorbachev was basically finished. He returned. As you can see, his wife seems to be in a dressing gown, and they had two daughters, I think. Wonderful daughter, you can see there. He was clearly sort of finished politically at this stage. He was sort of brought back to Moscow, but by that stage, particularly Ukraine and Belarus and Russia itself under Yeltsin were determined to break up the Soviet Union and go their own way as independent states. And a major referendum was held throughout the USSR on the 1st of December, where virtually everybody voted for independence for their republics within something called the Commonwealth of Independent States, which basically Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. Belarus is to the north of Ukraine. The capital is Minsk. It's on the Polish border. The three republics sort of agreed that there should be independence, and it should be done in this sort of format. And finally, at the very end of the year, on the 21st of December 1991, the Soviet Union came to an end with a meeting in Kazakhstan at Almaty, which said USSR is at an end, the Commonwealth of Independent States, which is what it said it was more or less, would replace it to ensure cooperation, so all the former Soviet republics would cooperate. Well, only 11 joined right then, because 4 said no thank you very much. Well, actually 3 said no thank you very much, and Ukraine said we'll join, but we're not going to come in on the military side at all. We'll be with you for economy only. And so it really wasn't a complete reproduction. The 3 that left, incidentally, you probably know, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, all invaded at the end of World War II and very unhappy to be under Soviet rule. So Ukraine's now independent, and it has Crimea. What is going to happen now to Crimea? Economically, it was a very rough time. The 1990s everywhere were very hard. They were advised by the West to go for a sort of democracy in the Western style, and more destructively, really, to free up their economies very, very quickly indeed, to go for a market economy on the Western model, which caused absolute chaos, inflation, unemployment, all sorts of things. And nowhere did it really succeed very well or very quickly. And in Ukraine, unfortunately, it probably, because its economy was quite complex, it was particularly bad. In 2015, so this is after Crimea has now been annexed by Russia, the Ukraine National Institute for Strategic Studies concluded that it completely failed to build a dynamic economy or an effective democracy or a fair legal system. And they said society is poor, divided, and helpless. So that was Ukraine. So it was in disarray, I think is what you might say. And its leadership did not do its credit. Its first 2 presidents were old Soviet Communist Party apparatchiks who were pretty corrupt. And in one case, definitely murderous, because several of his opponents were found lying around with their heads cut off. In 2004, Ukraine really hit the headlines, and you may remember that from seeing the pictures, when there was a presidential election in Ukraine with a pro-Russian guy called Viktor Yanukovych and a pro-Ukrainian hero who was called, I'm sorry about this. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. What was he called? Gone out of my head. Sorry, doesn't matter. We'll come back to it. Anyway, there was an election in 2004, and that's right, Viktor Yanukovych and Viktor Yushchenko, who had been poisoned, probably by a Russian agency, before the elections and very nearly died. Do you remember he had terrible skin after that? Do you remember that? Anyway, he lost the election, and nobody could understand why, because everybody had expected him to win. And blow me down, of course, the results have been tampered with. And so the first of what became known as the colour revolutions happened. Ukrainians came out on the streets of the Maidan, which is a Turkish word which they use for a square in Ukrainian, the Independence Square, we would say, and demonstrated in the middle of winter, forced a recount, which Yushchenko won. But Yushchenko, unfortunately, was no more effective than his predecessors had been. So there was a complete failure there. Now, the Crimea was obviously a terribly sort of sore point between Russia and Crimea, for various reasons. As one American institution calls it, they say that Russian-Ukrainian relations were testy but manageable until Putin came along in 2000. In fact, in the 1990s, the Ukrainians were the smug ones because they got Crimea and Sevastopol and the fleet and all that, and the Russians were the ones who were fed up. Today, it's very much the other way around. But if we look at the various agreements that Russia signed in the 1990s, we will see that 4 times, absolutely unmistakably, they guaranteed Ukraine's territorial integrity, and that included Crimea. They did so, first of all, by the Almaty Declaration at the end of 1991, where each of the republics was deemed to be independent with the frontiers that it had at the time, which in Ukraine's case, of course, included Crimea. The second time was in 1992. No, sorry, we'll do it, what should I do? Okay. In 1992, the United Nations Security Council itself guaranteed, or said, that Ukraine's territorial integrity, including Crimea, must be preserved, because the Russian parliament had passed a resolution claiming that the 1954 transfer was, quote, legally invalid. You remember I said it was not legally invalid, it was quite valid, but there we are. The third one was that in 1992 as well, Ukraine was one of the frontline states, you might say. It had something like, golly, how many was it now? 5,000 Soviet nuclear warheads on its territory, as did Belarus, which is also, you see, on the frontier. Kazakhstan did too, further over in the east, and Russia. They were the four republics who had nuclear stations on their grounds, weapons. And it gave up or destroyed all its weapons. It either gave them back to Russia or it destroyed them. And in the agreement following that, which was guaranteed by Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom, and later by China and France, known as the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, Ukraine's territorial integrity was guaranteed, not only by the Russians, but also by four major world powers. So there is no doubt about it that in every possible way, Ukraine had every right to hang on to Crimea. Lastly, in fact, in 1997, after painful negotiations on what to do with Sevastopol, which of course was, let's go and have another picture, there we are, was the major thing really between Russia and Ukraine, because they wanted to have the Black Sea Fleet. In 1997, when Russia and Ukraine finally made a deal, it took them a long time, the fleet was divided. And again, Russia said, Ukraine's territory is inviolable. We accept Ukraine as it is today. And the only thing was that this huge fleet of 800 ships and about 100,000 servicemen, that's what the Black Sea Fleet was all about, was divided. The Ukrainians got roughly a third of it, and the Russians got 2/3. That was in 1997 at the treaty that I have just mentioned in 1997. Not only did they divide it, but because the Russians recognized that Sevastopol was definitely in Ukraine, they agreed to rent part of the harbor for their fleet, and did so. And the Ukrainians first of all said, okay, $98 million a year will be fine. Later on, they raised it to $2.5 billion. So it got a bit expensive, but the Russians had to accept that. And it was always going there then was interesting, because the Ukrainians would say, oh, that's their rubbish over there. Look at our lovely ships on this side. It was quite interesting. But you see, a turning point came when Vladimir Putin was elected president of Russia on New Year's Eve, wasn't it, of 1999. And he, as you know, one of his great, powerful promises to the Russian people was that he would restore Russia's national pride, make it respected in the world again. And that is what, he set out to do and has been doing ever since, for better or for worse. So the sort of power vacuum in Russia under Yeltsin, who became increasingly less effective and more alcoholic as the 90s went on, is no longer a power vacuum. And a President Putin, who initially was quite pro-Western, seemed to want to sort of go along with the West and cooperate, by 2007 was becoming openly hostile to the West. And this was going to have implications, obviously, as we will see, for Crimea. To return now, I mentioned Mr. Yushchenko, who became president in 2005 after a recount in Kiev, and who turned out not to be nearly as effective as people had hoped. In 2010, in the next elections, he lost but legally this time, and honestly, to the pro-Russian Viktor Yanukovych, who became president in 2010 and proceeded in the most extraordinary way. I mean, they'd always been corrupt, but what Yanukovych managed to set aside in the 4 years that he had. I mean, if you go online, you can look at the houses and his private zoo and all the things that he had. It's quite extraordinary in a really quite poor country. He also was not really there, you might say, for the Russian people. Under Yushchenko, one of the things was that there was a movement towards joining the European Union. Most younger Ukrainians, at any rate, wanted Ukraine to be part of Europe. What they did not want to do is to be part of Russia in any sense whatsoever. They applied to join the European Union and were given what's called an association agreement, which had still to be signed. That was the normal way into the European Union, done by Poland, Czech Republic, and all those countries back in the early 2000s. They hadn't signed it yet, but they were going to. Now, the general sort of process seemed to be that when you joined the European Union, you also became able to join NATO, or at least you could apply to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, I think from what you know about Russia and Mr. Putin, you will see that he did not want a former Soviet republic. He'd already got the Baltic states, but they're small. They're put in NATO. He did not want Ukraine in NATO at any cost. It wasn't so much the European Union, but he wanted the whole thing stopped. He gave orders almost certainly to Yanukovych, who said, right, we'll stop it. This was in the late months of 2013, if I'm not mistaken. And it was announced that the deal with Europe was on hold. There wasn't going to be any European Union membership. Whereupon there was a massive demonstration, again on the Independence Square in Kiev. It's often known as Euromaidan because it was about joining Europe, or alternately the Revolution of Dignity. And this time, in 2004 to 5, it was peaceful, more or less. This time it was violent. And people were sniping from rooftops, and something over 100 people died, which, was pretty shattering in a civilized European city. Yanukovych fled to Rostov-on-Don in Russia and asked the Russians to send in troops to restore law and order. There was chaos in Kiev. Nobody was in power. There was a complete power vacuum, and this was an opportunity which could not be missed. Late in the night, on the 22nd to 23rd of February 2014, Mr. Putin was discussing the Ukraine crisis with his military staff and remarked, "We must start working on returning Crimea to Russia." So, as one writer says, an American journalist, annexation was carefully planned and launched while there was a political vacuum in Ukraine, as we've seen, a tactical masterstroke. From late in sorry, I must be going the wrong way. Oh, there, sorry, that's the Orange Revolution. I've got a few pictures I haven't shown you. Euromaidan. There's the ones I want. Late in 2013, military men with no insignia started to be seen, not so much in Sevastopol, which was very Russian anyway, but in Simferopol, the capital of Crimea, which is inland. Nobody knew who they were or what they were doing there, and they were just called the Little Green Men. Somebody heard some of them speaking Serbian to each other, so the chances are that some of them were mercenaries. Serbia and Russia being very close, in fact, in any case. And there may have even been some Cossacks around. As Charles Clover puts it, it was an infiltration, not an invasion. They were all there. And then suddenly, on the 27th of February 2014, these blokes stormed the parliament in Simferopol, the Crimean parliament, grabbed key sites, installed a pro-Russian government, locked up the Ukrainian troops in their barracks and then kicked them out, and cut all links with Ukraine. There were a few fatal casualties, but by and large this was not a very bloody affair. It was quick, it was surgical, it was efficient. As far as the West was concerned, the only sort of constructive thing I can find that anybody did was McDonald's, which closed its outlets in Crimea in protest. There was very little reaction from the West. It took certainly no military action to help, and it said that they advised the Ukrainians not to resist because it would just lead to terrible bloodshed. So there we are. Suddenly this has all happened, and I'm sure you remember. To make this look better, the Russians announced that there will be a referendum. Do you want to be part of Russia, or would you like to go on being part of Ukraine? And they gave them this choice, and they put up the posters of this sort. As I've said, it says we're voting on 16th of March. Do you want this? Now note what they've put there. Or this, a lovely Russian flag. Anyway, they had the referendum on the 16th of March. It was massively, as one historian puts it, reminiscent of Brezhnev-era polls. There was one part of Sevastopol where 123% of registered voters voted for reunification. Think of that. The Tatars stayed home. I don't know, Ukrainians were leaving in droves at this stage. The Russians showed that it was not an annexation, it was simply self-determination taking place. And it had foreign observers, it claimed, 135 of them, but the Ukraine says they were all from right-wing European organisations, so I don't know. It doesn't seem to me that it was probably properly monitored, but anyway, it happened. Now we'll come back. I think we'll go on to you can look at that map while I chat, because it's very relevant. Why did Putin do it, for goodness sake? Well, I think quite obviously, and most people got to this one, is to rebuild his popularity in Russia, which was rather declining at the time. Returning territory, Russian territory, to the Russian Federation. He said, in the hearts and minds of people, Crimea has always been and remains an inseparable part of Russia. Has always been, since 1783. Oh well, anyway, that's quite a long time, but not always. The second, his support in fact soared to over 80%. So it was all very wonderful. The Russian Parliament, the Duma, passed a law annexing Ukraine, and everything was nice. Almost immediately, trouble started in the most eastern provinces of Ukraine. What is well known now as the Donbas, which simply means the basin of the Don River, which flows on the border between Russia and Ukraine and out into the Sea of Azov. And that area is an industrial treasure for Ukraine, which is by and large not terribly industrial, it's more agricultural, but it is heavily Russian in its population, although many people would say they were Ukrainian citizens, but they spoke Russian. 40% of Ukrainians speak Russian. It doesn't mean very much, actually. But anyway, so the second point was to destabilize Ukraine, to stop it at all costs from slipping west, joining the EU, and most of all from joining NATO. The Donbass was seized early in 2014 by so-called separatists, very much backed by the Russians. How many of them are actually Russian who were involved in it, we don't know. Had come from Russia and in Russian space, we have no idea. And since then, the war has been off and on and off and on. It's a sort of frozen war, people call it now. But 13,000 people have died since it started. And about 2 million people have left their homes and are homeless. So it's quite serious. The third reason, clearly, was to get Sevastopol for the Russian Navy's sole use. And that makes sense, doesn't it? Whoever controls Sevastopol controls the whole Black Sea region, says an official in his party, United Russia. And Putin himself said, listen to this, I do not wish to go to Sevastopol to be welcomed by NATO sailors. Aha. Well, actually, NATO and the Ukraine Navy are now doing exercises all the time, but not, of course, from Sevastopol. The Black Sea Navy, Russia's Black Sea Navy, has been enlarged and refurbished, and and it's much the biggest, Sevastopol is much the biggest of the 3 naval ports which it has on the Black Sea, the others being Feodosia in Crimea, and then Novorossiysk, which is over on the eastern shore, Russian eastern shore of the Black Sea. And then finally, just cock a snook at the West to say, there you are, you see I can do it and you can't stop me. He's become almost emotionally hostile to the West. At a speech given only 2 days after the referendum in the magnificent St. George's Hall of the Kremlin, Putin's anger really showed through. He aired a long list of grievances that he felt the West had imposed upon Russia. He said Russia had been cheated again and again, decisions have been taken behind our back, it's going to stop, we will do what we're going to do. And that's an example. And what did the West do about it? Well, as we know, not very much. Sanctions were imposed. I don't think they've caused a great deal of harm. They are still in place. Whether they will remain in place, I don't know. Russia was expelled from the G8 group of most prominent economic nations in the world, for what that is worth, and from the Council of Europe as well. And in fact, legally speaking, only 17 states recognize in the world that Crimea is part of Russia, and most of those will be in the Commonwealth of Independent States. There are 1 or 2 others. A United Nations General Assembly resolution at the end of March in 2014 upheld Ukraine's territorial integrity, rejected the Crimean referendum, and was passed by 100 votes to 11. So 11 voted against it, including obviously Russia, 58 abstentions, including, listen to this, South Africa, China, Brazil, and India. That's BRICS for you. Aha, right. Now, how has it been since 2014? How's Crimea? It's probably looking much smarter than it did before. It was quite shabby. The Ukrainians perhaps didn't spend much money on it, perhaps they couldn't. The Russians have spent an absolute fortune on Crimea. First of all, they built, well, not first of all, but they have built this extraordinary bridge. Because if you look, sorry, I was going back to the previous one, there, Crimea has no land borders with Russia. Can you see that? There is only the narrow straits leading from the Black Sea into the Sea of Azov, which I think you can see there, which are about 20 kilometers wide. And whoops, no, wrong one. There it is. There is where the bridge was built. It's 19.4 kilometers long. It's certainly the longest bridge in Europe, I gather not in the world. And it's a most extraordinary feat of engineering. It was done remarkably quickly. And that's a road bridge, and it was opened in May 2018. No, they've gone further. Aha. Just a few weeks ago, at the end of 2019, let's go on. There we are. They opened the railway line. So it's a road bridge and a railway bridge, and you can now travel from Russia, because all the links via Ukraine are broken. You could travel straight from Russia into Simferopol. There was a huge celebration at Simferopol when the first train arrived, and guess who was on board? Whether he was actually, I think it was Stalin who was known as the great locomotive driver of history. But, here's another one. He is an extraordinary man. So there we are. But Crimea is very isolated. Its links are only with Russia. You can still cross into Ukraine if you have the right visa, but there are always very long queues at the Isthmus of Perikop. They've got a brand new airport at Simferopol, very grand indeed, but it only flies in and out of Russia. So far, the isolation has shown. There's been a bad water shortage because, of course, the Ukrainians cut off the North Crimea Canal. So they cut the water right down. The harvest failed in 2014, but now the Russians have built reservoirs and are looking for new water sources, and they can say, bye-bye canal, it doesn't matter. Similarly, the electricity used to come from Ukraine, and they cut the electricity off often, particularly if they were feeling cross with the Russians about other private quarrels that Russia and Ukraine have. And now Russia has built, oh, I wish they'd come, and, no, I don't actually, but they have built very quickly 2 very effective new power stations and are independent. Crimea is independent. We won't go into that one. Right. I haven't got time to do too much more, but I just want to tell you a couple of things. One thing that's fascinated me has been the rewriting of Crimea's history, which has definitely taken place. There's a lovely Soviet joke, which a Russian friend of mine once, I asked him, you know, what was going to happen next in Russia, and he said, Sara, he said, in Russia, future like history, difficult to predict. Anyway, so, which is very interesting because history can be rewritten, as we well know. The non-Russian past has largely been effaced. Even to somebody went on a tour, and in the tour group, someone asked, who was here before the Russians? Because we think you came quite recently. And the tour guide just said, oh, some Turks. Anyway, so there we are. But more seriously, there's a lot of out-migration on the part of Ukrainians in particularly, and sites very important to Russia's sort of patriotic version of history are being upgraded, particularly Sevastopol, of course, as you can imagine, which is a quasi-sacred site of the collective memory, Orlando Figes calls it in his book. Statues abound again. They put up a statue of Alexander III at Bassandra. Livadia's got another nice statue. And in Simferopol, a splendid, enormous statue of Catherine the Great, which was knocked down at the time of the Revolution, but put in a storeroom somewhere and just left, has been popped back on her plinth and magnificently refurbished, together with, at the bottom, there, you can see right down on the bottom there was some white writing, and that is a new thing which says, this monument has been rebuilt in honor of the reunification of Crimea with Russia in 2014 and for all time. So there you are. Now, Mr. Putin loves going to Crimea and does so frequently, and you may know that he's quite a motorbike aficionado. There's a group called the Night Wolves, who, a bit like the, I forget what they're called, you know, but they don't exactly do charity, but they ride Harley Davidsons anyway, and he loves joining them on rides. And they get a lot of money from the Russian government for all their activities. Anyway, they did a ride into Yalta once, not so long ago, and there he is, looking for once rather sort of casual and relaxed, and on a bike, which he obviously enjoys very much. But he does go there quite often, and of course he is wildly, wildly popular down there. The Black Sea Navy I told you all about, and there were, in fact, joint naval exercises off Crimea last week. You see, it's funny. I knew you would laugh. I knew you would laugh at this, and I put it in because I laughed when I saw it too. But it isn't funny. This is how Russians like to see their leaders. We might have wanted to see Churchill looking vaguely stern at some point during World War II, but otherwise, I think we like our leaders to be user-friendly. But that's not the Russian way, and people debate endlessly why. He's a formidable character. There he is. As one writer said, the Black Sea Fleet has been rebuilt and re-equipped. It's now got 45 warships and 7 subs at Sevastopol and others at the other Black Sea fleets. Russia has also brought in the military. There are large military bases there. And as somebody said, it stuffed Crimea full of missiles, including the famous S-400 air defense system, which they have sold to the Iranians and various other people. In the course of this catastrophe, of course, Ukraine lost 3/4 of its ships and military personnel when Sevastopol, when Crimea was taken back by Russia. And they have had, they are having a terrible job to rebuild their navy, and their only port now is Odessa, which with any luck they hope the Russians will leave alone. The economy is not doing badly. As I've said, it all looks much smarter. They've also built a fantastic coast road, sort of Corniche, all the way down the scenic part there, from Sevastopol to Yalta and on to Kerch. The wine industry is doing well. There's not been a lot of inward investment, unfortunately, for them. They would like to see more, I think. And what is more is if you can't be lucky enough, they have found large oil and gas deposits offshore in the Black Sea, and nearly all of those will fall not to Ukraine, which is very short of such things, but to Russia, who has vast, incredible supplies in Siberia and elsewhere too. So things are not going badly, although the local population does complain. The Tatars, who came back in quite large numbers in the 1990s, are under terrible suspicion. The Russians think that any Muslim population is a sort of potential terrorist threat, and it's been very difficult for them. So a lot of Tatars have left, but the older people who spent most of their lives in Uzbekistan and came back, it's rather sad. I read that one old man said, "We didn't return from Central Asia to Crimea just to leave again." And they came back and found everything gone and had to make a new life for themselves. He said, "We will behave like